There is no headstone, no name cut into the stone, no marker of any kind, nothing to tell a visitor whose grave this was ever supposed to be. Only a flat, unremarkable slab set into the floor of a small island church, close to the altar, on a lake so still it barely seems to move even in daylight. For close to 500 years, local tradition said that slab marked the resting place of the most feared ruler Wallachia had ever produced, a prince who terrorized 2 empires in his lifetime, a man whose family name would later be borrowed, second-hand and half understood, for the most famous monster in Western fiction, and a man who, the moment he died on a winter battlefield, seemed to vanish almost entirely from the physical record. No confirmed body, no funeral account, no witnessed burial anyone could later point to and say with certainty, "He is here." In the summer of 1933, a Romanian archaeologist named Dinu V. Rosetti decided it was time to find out whether the tradition was even true. Not because anyone had raised new doubts about it, simply because, remarkably, in nearly 4.5 centuries, no one ever had. He and his team lifted the stone. Whatever they expected to find underneath, it was not this. And what they found, or rather, what they did not find, is the reason this story is still being argued about by historians on 2 continents nearly a century later, in scholarship published as recently as this year. Hello, and welcome to Dark-Historium, where the world's greatest stories never fade. Tonight's story does not end with an answer. It ends, honestly, with 3 answers, from 3 different countries, that cannot all be true at once, and a grave that, as far as the physical evidence has ever shown, has never actually held a body at all. This is the story of Vlad the Third of Wallachia, the man history calls Vlad the Impaler, the man whose family name, centuries later and an ocean away, would be borrowed by a novelist who never once mentions the real, unresolved mystery you are about to hear. Settle in, let the story carry you. And if part of you drifts off before the end, that's all right. This is a story built to be heard in pieces, the way most of history actually survives, incomplete, argued over, and still, after all this time, worth following as far as the evidence will actually take us. We will follow him from a hostage's tent in the Ottoman court, through a throne seized and lost 3 separate times, to a battlefield where the historical record itself seems to lose track of him, and then to 3 very different places, in 3 very different countries, where people are still, tonight, arguing about where he actually ended up. We begin, as Rosetti did, at the stone. Snagov is not an easy place to reach even today. It sits on a small island in a lake north of Bucharest, ringed by forest, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that, for most of its history, simply did not exist. To reach the monastery, a visitor needed a boat, a reason, and usually an invitation. That isolation was exactly the point. Wallachian princes did not choose their resting places at random. A monastery like Snagov, remote, defensible, already wealthy with donated land and fortified walls, was the kind of place a ruler endowed specifically because he expected, one day, to be buried there. Vlad the Third had done exactly that. Historical records confirm he gave land and privileges to Snagov Monastery during his reign, the ordinary behavior of a prince securing his own memory and his own soul's care, in the hands of monks who would outlive him. So when Vlad died, in battle, in the winter of 1476 into 1477, a detail this story will return to later, It was not unreasonable for tradition to assume his body had been carried the short distance to the monastery he himself had supported, and buried there, close to the altar, in the position of honor reserved for a founder and patron. For nearly 450 years, that assumption simply sat undisturbed. No one dug, no one checked. The story was old, and it was plausible, and in the absence of anyone actually looking, plausible was enough. Dinu Rosetti did not think plausible was enough. Across the summer and into the autumn of 1933, Rosetti carried out a formal excavation of Snagov's main church, the first real archaeological attempt to test the tradition rather than simply repeat it. He opened the ground beneath the stone that local memory had always pointed to, the stone unmarked by any name, unmarked by any date, but agreed upon, generation after generation, as the grave of the prince. Rosetti's own account of what he found is direct, and it is the reason this mystery exists in the form it does today. Under that stone, there was no tomb. There was no coffin, no chamber, no burial at all, in the structural sense the tradition implied. What Rosetti's team actually recovered, in his own words, was this: bones and jaws of horses. Not the remains of a Wallachian prince, the remains of animals. It is worth sitting with how strange that finding actually is, because it is stranger than the grave was empty. An empty grave would at least confirm that a grave had once been dug there for a person, and that the person was later moved, or lost, or robbed. What Rosetti found instead suggests something closer to whatever had shaped the ground beneath that stone across the centuries. It may never have been a human burial in the first place. Horse bones inside a supposed royal tomb point toward stabling, or disturbed earlier ground, or simple confusion about which patch of monastery floor the tradition had actually been pointing to for 4.5 centuries. None of those explanations gives you Vlad III's body. All of them take the mystery in a slightly different and slightly more unsettling direction. Consider what has to be true for a wrong grave finding like this to happen at all. Snagov was not an abandoned ruin in 1933. It had been an active, continuously used monastery for hundreds of years, its monks responsible, generation after generation, for maintaining exactly this kind of memory. And yet somewhere across those centuries, through wars, through Ottoman raids that reached even this isolated island, through fires, rebuildings, and the simple erosion of oral memory passed from one generation of monks to the next, the physical thread connecting a specific patch of church floor to a specific set of remains appears to have quietly snapped. No one forged the tradition maliciously. No one seems to have lied about it. The stone was pointed to in good faith for 4.5 centuries by people who genuinely believed it marked the prince's grave. And it may simply have been the wrong stone, in a building where the right one, if it ever existed at all, was lost to the ordinary, unglamorous erosion of time long before Rosetti ever arrived with a shovel. Rosetti's team did not stop there. Close to the church door, not at the position of honor near the altar, but at a plainer, less prestigious spot, they found a second grave. This one was not empty in the way the first was. It contained an unidentified body, along with fragments of fabric that appeared, even in their degraded state, richer than what a common monk or ordinary parishioner would have been buried in. Rich cloth, an unmarked position, no name, no confirming object, nothing that tied those remains definitively to anyone. Was this Vlad, quietly reburied at some later point in a plainer plot after violence, or theft, or simple disorganization scattered his original resting place? Or was it someone else entirely, another wealthy patron, another unnamed benefactor of the monastery, dressed well enough in death to leave a trace of fine fabric behind? Rosetti's excavation could not say, and in the 9 decades since, no one else has been able to say either. The fabric has never been definitively tied to Vlad III. It has also never been definitively tied to anyone else. It simply sits in the historical record as a genuinely open question, a second, smaller mystery, nested inside the larger one, that this story will return to later, once you have the fuller shape of the man it might, or might not, belong to. There is something almost deliberately unsatisfying about a grave positioned at the church door rather than the altar. In the religious architecture of the period, position mattered. Burial close to the altar was the mark of a founder, a patron, someone the monastery wished to honor in death as it had been supported by them in life. Burial near the door was, by comparison, ordinary, sometimes even faintly dishonorable, reserved for those the community did not feel compelled to elevate. If those unidentified remains near the door really do belong to Vlad III, they would represent something stranger than an empty grave. They would represent a demotion, a prince who, in death, was not placed where a founder belonged, but pushed instead toward the threshold, for reasons no surviving record explains. What Rosetti's dig accomplished, in the end, was not an answer. It was the opposite of an answer. It took a 450-year-old assumption, quiet, comfortable, never seriously tested, and replaced it with a documented, physical absence. No body, where the tradition insisted a body would be. And once that absence was on the historical record, in a real excavation report rather than a rumor, the search for where Vlad III actually ended up stopped being a question anyone could politely avoid. It has not stopped since. To understand why this particular grave, empty or not, mattered enough for 3 countries to still be arguing over it, nearly a century after Rosetti's shovel first hit that horsebone-filled ground, you have to go back much further than 1933. You have to go back to a hostage boy in an Ottoman court, a father who joined a chivalric order named for a dragon, and the strange, specific chain of decisions that turned an obscure Wallachian prince into a name the entire world would eventually recognize, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the actual life he lived. Vlad III was born around 1431 in the town of Sighișoara, in what is now central Romania, the second son of Vlad II, ruler of Wallachia, a small, fiercely contested principality wedged between 2 vastly larger powers, the Kingdom of Hungary to the north and the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south. Wallachia's rulers, across most of the 15th century, did not get to rule quietly. They governed a borderland, and borderlands survive by choosing sides, switching sides, and occasionally being crushed between the sides they chose. Vlad too understood this as well as anyone. At some point before his son's birth, he was inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric brotherhood founded by the Holy Roman Emperor, dedicated, at least officially, to defending Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion. Membership in the order came with a title, and the title came with a name. In Romanian, the word for dragon is Drac. Vlad, too, began to be known, in documents and in common speech, as Vlad Dracul, Vlad, son of the dragon, or Vlad the Dragon, depending on how the word was read. His son, Vlad III, inherited the name in its diminutive form, Dracula, son of Dracul, son of the dragon. It is worth being completely plain about this, because it is one of the most persistently misunderstood facts in this entire story. The name Dracula has nothing to do with vampires, nothing to do with the supernatural at all, in its original 15th century use. It is a heraldic title, tied to a real chivalric order, worn by a real father and passed to a real son, 450 years before a novelist in London ever picked up a pen. Keep that origin in mind. This story will come back to it, because centuries later, that same dragon symbol resurfaces in a place none of Vlad's contemporaries could ever have predicted, and it becomes one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire modern mystery. The Order of the Dragon itself was not a symbolic curiosity. It was a real, functioning political and military brotherhood, founded to bind together the rulers of Central and Eastern Europe against a very specific, very immediate threat: the westward expansion of the Ottoman Empire, then still in living memory of having taken Constantinople's outer territories piece by piece. To wear the dragon was to declare, publicly, which side of that struggle a ruler stood on. It is one of the deeper ironies of this entire story that the son of a man who joined that order specifically to resist Ottoman power would spend his own childhood as a hostage inside the Ottoman court, absorbing its language and its methods from the inside, before turning that same education back against the empire that gave it to him. But in the 1440s, none of that lay ahead yet. What lay ahead, for young Vlad III and his younger brother Radu, was captivity. Wallachia's position between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire meant its rulers were expected to prove their loyalty in the most direct way available to a medieval power broker, by handing over their own children as hostages. Around 1442, Vlad II sent his two younger sons, Vlad III, roughly 11 years old, and Radu, younger still, into Ottoman custody as a guarantee of his own continued cooperation with Sultan Murad II. The boys were not treated as prisoners in chains. They were educated at the Ottoman court, in the Turkish language, in horsemanship, in the customs and administration of the empire that held them. Radu, by most accounts, adapted to this environment with relative ease, forming connections that would serve him for the rest of his life. Connections that would matter enormously later, when the two brothers found themselves on opposite sides of Wallachia's throne. Vlad, the sources broadly agree, did not adapt the same way. Whatever specific experiences shaped that difference, the surviving record does not describe in intimate detail. We do not have young Vlad's private thoughts, his diary, his own account of those years. What we have is the outcome: a boy who left Ottoman captivity several years later, having learned the language, the tactics, and the political machinery of the empire that had held him, and having learned it, it seems, as a lesson in power rather than as an education in loyalty. It is worth pausing on how young he actually was for this. 11 years old is not an age at which a person chooses their political education. It is an age at which a political education is simply done to them, by adults making decisions about thrones and alliances. An 11-year-old has no say in and very little power to resist. Whatever kind of ruler Vlad III eventually became, he became it starting from that specific involuntary position, a child handed over as collateral, in a court that was not his own, among people who held his life as leverage against his father's cooperation. None of this excuses what came later. It does explain, as much as the surviving record allows anything to explain, where the calculation in him seems to have been formed. Wallachia's throne, at this point in its history, was not a single royal line's uncontested property. It was fought over by two rival branches of the same extended family: Vlad's own line, later known as the Draculești, and a competing line known as the Danești, and for decades, whichever branch could secure the stronger outside backer, Hungarian or Ottoman, tended to hold the throne, until the other branch found a stronger backer in turn. It is against this specific backdrop of rotating, externally sponsored claimants that everything which follows has to be understood. Vlad III was not entering a stable kingdom as its rightful heir. He was entering a decades-long family civil war that had already cost his father his life once the political wind changed. In 1447, while his sons remained hostages, Vlad II was killed, assassinated, in an internal Wallachian power struggle backed by rival factions with Hungarian support, and widely understood by historians to have involved Danești-aligned boyars acting with Hungarian encouragement. His eldest son, Mircea, was killed shortly after, reportedly buried alive by his political enemies, a detail sourced from period chronicles rather than physical forensic evidence, and one this account holds at the level those chronicles support, a strongly attested account, not a verified forensic fact. Vlad III, still a teenager, was now the surviving heir to a throne he did not hold, in a country run by the men who had killed his father, watched from inside the court of the empire that had raised him as a hostage for exactly this kind of leverage. Whatever grief he was permitted to feel, the surviving record does not preserve it. What it preserves instead is what happened next, and what happened next was entirely political. The Ottomans, recognizing an opportunity, released him, not out of mercy, but calculation. A grateful, Ottoman-shaped claimant to the Wallachian throne was a useful thing to have in reserve, a lever to pull whenever Wallachia's current ruler drifted too far into Hungary's orbit for Ottoman comfort. In 1448, with Ottoman military support at his back, Vlad III, still a teenager, rode into Wallachia and seized the throne from Vladislav II, the Danești line ruler whose faction had killed his father the previous year. It lasted a matter of months. Vladislav, backed in turn by Hungarian forces and by John Hunyadi personally, the same Hunyadi who would, strangely enough, become Vlad's own sponsor less than a decade later, returned before the year was out and pushed the teenage claimant back out of the country he had just seized. Vlad fled, not to the Ottomans this time, but in the other direction entirely, into exile among the very Hungarian-aligned powers who had just unseated him. Political survival, at this stage of his life, meant something very specific: switching patrons the instant the current one stopped being useful, without the luxury of loyalty to either side, and without much apparent concern for which empire's soldiers had put him on the throne, or which had taken it away again. That instinct, the ability to abandon one sponsor for another, the moment the balance of power shifted, did not vanish once he grew older and more secure. It became, if anything, the defining shape of his entire political career. 3 separate reigns, 3 separate losses of power, and a life spent almost entirely balanced between 2 empires that each wanted him only as long as he served their purposes, and were each willing to discard him, without much ceremony, the moment he stopped. It is worth carrying that shape with you into the next part of this story, because it explains something later chapters will otherwise make difficult to understand. Why a man who fought so fiercely against the Ottoman Empire could, at the same time, be imprisoned by his own supposed Christian allies, and why loyalty for Vlad III was never something he could safely assume ran in both directions. The throne he actually held, the reign later chroniclers, and later still, an entire genre of fiction, would build a legend on, did not begin until 1456, and it did not begin cleanly. For roughly 8 years after his brief, failed first attempt, Vlad lived as an exile among Wallachia's Hungarian-aligned neighbors, watching from the margins while the throne he considered his own passed through other hands. His fortunes changed with the rise of John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent and one of the most formidable military leaders in the region's fight against Ottoman expansion. Hunyadi, for reasons of his own strategic calculation rather than any particular loyalty to Vlad personally, backed his return. In 1456, with Hunyadi's support behind him, Vlad III retook the Wallachian throne for the second time, and this time he held it, not briefly, not for a season before being pushed back out. For 6 years, from 1456 to 1462, Vlad ruled Wallachia as its recognized voivode, and it is almost entirely this 6-year window, not the earlier failed months, not the later, shorter third reign still to come, that the rest of this story, and the entire modern reputation of Vlad the Impaler, is actually built from. What did he do with those 6 years? He consolidated. A Wallachian throne inherited through assassination and contested by rival claimants was not a secure one, and Vlad moved, from nearly the beginning of this reign, to make it secure, by breaking the power of the very boyar class whose factional infighting had killed his father and older brother in the first place. The details of exactly how he did this, the specific methods, the specific numbers of people affected, are the subject of the next part of this story, and they deserve to be handled with more care than a quick summary allows. For now, the shape of it is enough. Vlad used the years of his second reign to centralize power in his own hands, at real and often brutal cost to the nobility who might otherwise have challenged him, and by most accounts, it worked. Whatever else can be said about the methods, Wallachia's throne, for the length of this reign, did not change hands through the kind of boyar-backed coup that had killed his father. This is worth pausing on, because it is easy, looking back from 5.5 centuries later, to see only the brutality and miss the political logic underneath it. Vlad was not a stable, secure ruler, indulging cruelty for its own sake. He was a twice-deposed claimant, the son of an assassinated father, trying to permanently break a specific, recurring cycle. Boyar factions who backed a rival, killed the sitting prince, and installed their own candidate, again and again, for as long as anyone could remember. Understanding that motive does not make what he did to achieve it less severe. It does explain why a ruler with his particular history might have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that half measures against that class of nobility would simply get him killed the way they had killed his father. Domestic consolidation was only half the balancing act. The other half was the Ottoman Empire, the same power that had raised him as a hostage, released him as a useful pawn, and now expected, as it expected from every Wallachian ruler, tribute and cooperation in exchange for being left alone. For the early years of his reign, Vlad paid it, the way his predecessors had, sometime around 1461 or 1462. That changed. The precise sequence of grievances that led to the break is not settled among historians with total certainty. Ottoman diplomatic pressure, competing loyalty concerns given his own Ottoman court upbringing, ambition, or some combination none of the surviving sources isolate cleanly. But the outcome is clear and well documented. Vlad stopped paying tribute, and in the winter of 1461 into 1462, he launched a direct military campaign across the Danube into Ottoman territory, a night assault against Ottoman forces and settlements that stands, even among historians skeptical of the more sensational later legends, as a genuinely significant act of open defiance against the most powerful military force in the region. Before that broader invasion arrived in full, Vlad attempted something more audacious than border raiding. In June of 1462, according to multiple period chronicle accounts, he led a small, fast-moving force across enemy lines at night, in disguise, deep into the camp where Sultan Mehmed himself was believed to be sleeping, an assassination attempt aimed directly at the Ottoman ruler, in the middle of his own army, on his own soil. The attempt failed to kill the Sultan. It did not fail to demonstrate exactly how far Vlad was willing to go, and exactly how personally he had chosen to fight this war. Chroniclers differ on the precise details of the raid, how deep it actually penetrated, how close it truly came to succeeding, and this account holds those specifics at the level the sources support. A real, disputed in detail but broadly attested night assault, not a settled, uniformly agreed account. The Ottoman response to the wider campaign was, predictably, overwhelming. Mehmed II, the same sultan who would, within a year of these events, complete the Ottoman conquest of most of the remaining Byzantine world, personally led a massive retaliatory invasion of Wallachia in the summer of 1462, an army the period sources describe as vastly outnumbering anything Vlad could field. Vlad, badly outnumbered, could not meet this force in open battle and win. What he could do, and by most accounts did, was wage a campaign of harassment, ambush, and deliberate psychological pressure against an invading army far larger than his own, burning his own territory ahead of the Ottoman advance, to deny them supplies and shelter, poisoning wells, striking at exposed columns under cover of darkness, and, by several period accounts, staging the kind of visible, deliberately terrifying displays along the invasion route that this story will examine directly and carefully in the chapter that follows. It was not enough to hold the throne. By late 1462, with his own position collapsing and, crucially, his younger brother Radu, the same brother who had adapted so comfortably to Ottoman court life 2 decades earlier, and had spent the intervening years building exactly the kind of relationships within the Ottoman military that Vlad's defiance had spent, now being put forward by the Ottomans as a friendlier, more cooperative alternative claimant. Vlad's second reign ended. Much of the Wallachian nobility, weighing a Vlad who had spent 6 years breaking their power against a Radu the Ottomans were prepared to install and support, began quietly shifting their allegiance. Vlad fled north, into the territory of the one power he had not yet exhausted as an ally, the Kingdom of Hungary and the court of Matthias Corvinus, Hunyadi's son and successor as its ruler. He expected refuge, the kind owed by the ordinary logic of 15th-century alliance politics, to a fellow Christian ruler who had just fought, at real personal risk, against the same Ottoman advance Hungary itself was sworn to resist. What he found instead, and the specific, disputed reason he found it, is one of the strangest and most genuinely contested turns in this entire story, and it deserves its own room rather than a summary here. There would be one more reign after this, a brief third return to the Wallachian throne, roughly a decade and a half later, near the very end of his life. And it is the manner of that final loss of power, not the earlier two, that eventually put him on the battlefield where he died, and left behind the empty grave this story began with. But first, the years his rule is actually remembered for, the terror, the forest of the impaled, and the uncomfortable necessary question of how much of what the record says about those years came from people who had every reason to make him sound as monstrous as language could manage. The name history remembers is not Vlad III. It is Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Tepes in Romanian, a nickname that did not fully attach itself to him during his own lifetime, so much as it did in the decades immediately after, when the accounts of what he had done during his second reign began circulating, first in handwritten pamphlets, then in some of the earliest printed material to come off the printing press anywhere in Europe. His preferred method of execution, for enemies foreign and domestic alike, was impalement, death by a sharpened stake, driven through the body and raised upright, left standing as a public, visible warning. This was not a method Vlad invented. Impalement had precedent as a punishment across the region, used by Ottoman authorities among others, in the world he had grown up inside. What set Vlad's use of it apart, according to the surviving accounts, was scale, visibility, and a kind of calculated theater. Rows of impaled bodies, left standing for extended periods, positioned along roads and around cities, specifically so that anyone approaching would see them from a distance, long before they arrived. The two groups the record describes him targeting most directly, in the years of his second reign, were his own domestic political enemies and a set of merchant communities in neighboring Transylvania. But before reaching either of those, it is worth addressing the single anecdote almost every retelling of this story leads with, because it belongs in a different evidence category than most of what follows. The story goes that a group of foreign envoys, Ottoman in most versions, appeared before Vlad and declined, per their own custom, to remove their turbans in his presence. Vlad, offended, is said to have ordered the turbans nailed directly to their heads, so that the custom they had refused to break would never be broken again. It is a vivid, quotable, endlessly repeated story. It is also one this account cannot verify past the level of a widely circulated period anecdote, present in several of the same pamphlet traditions, already flagged as propaganda adjacent, with no independent corroborating source of comparable weight to the broader chronicle material. This account repeats it here only to name it, and to place it exactly where the evidence puts it. A famous story, not a confirmed event, and a useful example of how difficult it already was, within decades of Vlad's death, to separate the documented ruler from the story being built around him. On the domestic side, the surviving chronicles describe a purge of the Wallachian boyar class, the same nobility whose factional infighting had killed his father and older brother, conducted with the specific goal of permanently ending their capacity to unseat him the way they had unseated his family before. Multiple period accounts describe a mass execution of boyars and their families early in this reign, timed in some versions to a religious feast day, with survivors reportedly forced into hard labor helping rebuild or fortify one of Vlad's mountain strongholds. The precise numbers involved, how many boyars, how many family members, how many died at the site versus during the forced labor that followed, vary significantly between sources, and this account will not repeat a specific casualty figure as settled fact, because the surviving figures are not settled. What is broadly agreed across multiple independent chronicle traditions is that the purge happened, that it was severe, and that it achieved its apparent political goal. No successful boyar-led coup unseated Vlad during the 6 years that followed. One detail from this purge has more corroboration behind it than most, and it deserves its own mention because it says something about how Vlad governed rather than just how he punished. Several chronicle traditions describe surviving boyars and their households not simply executed, but marched, on foot, a genuinely long distance from Targoviste to the mountains, and put to forced labor, rebuilding or expanding one of Vlad's strongholds, a fortress historians generally identify with the site later known as Poenari, perched on a cliff above the Argeș River. If accurate, this detail matters for a reason, beyond its cruelty. It suggests a ruler using punishment not only to remove threats, but to extract labor and permanently relocate the physical, symbolic seat of his power to a location the old boyar establishment had no prior claim to and no easy path to reach. Terror, in other words, was not incidental to Vlad's method of rule. It appears, across multiple independent strands of the record, to have been the method itself, deliberate, targeted, and put to direct political use rather than simply unleashed. The second major target were the Transylvanian Saxon merchant towns, German-speaking trading communities, most prominently Brașov and Sibiu, sitting just across Wallachia's northern border, which had a long, tangled economic and political relationship with Wallachia's rulers. Vlad's grievances with these towns were partly economic, disputes over trade routes and tariffs, and partly political, since these same towns had, at various points, sheltered and supported rival claimants to Vlad's own throne, including members of the Dynasty line his family had been fighting for a generation. Vlad's campaigns against these towns, described in multiple surviving accounts, involved raids, executions, and, again, according to the same accounts, impalement, used publicly and visibly against merchants and captured townspeople, apparently as both punishment and warning to the wider Saxon trading network. One of the most frequently repeated episodes from this campaign describes a raid on the outskirts of Brașov itself, in which Vlad's forces are said to have burned a suburb of the city and impaled a large number of its residents along the surrounding hillside. An image period pamphlet illustrations later seized on directly, producing some of the most widely reproduced woodcuts of the entire Dracula print tradition, images that would go on to shape European visual imagination of Vlad for centuries after anyone alive could verify what the raid itself had actually looked like. It is precisely these Saxon accounts, however, that carry the single largest source reliability problem in this entire chapter of the story, and it deserves to be named directly rather than passed over. The most widely circulated, most extreme casualty figures associated with Vlad's reign: tens of thousands killed, entire towns supposedly emptied, trace back overwhelmingly to German-language pamphlets produced in the years and decades after his death, largely by or for audiences in exactly the Saxon merchant communities he had targeted. These were not neutral historical records. They were, in significant part, wartime and post-war propaganda, produced by people with direct personal and political motive to make Vlad appear as monstrous as language could manage. Material that also happened to arrive in German-speaking Europe at almost exactly the moment the printing press made mass reproduction of shocking pamphlets newly possible and newly profitable. None of this means Vlad's documented brutality against these communities did not happen. Independent chronicle traditions, including ones with no obvious propaganda motive, corroborate the basic pattern of impalement used as a political tool against both domestic and Saxon enemies. It does mean that any specific casualty number quoted from these pamphlets should be treated exactly as the source demands, not as a verified historical fact, but as a disputed, propaganda-adjacent figure that this account will not repeat as though it were confirmed. The single most famous scene associated with Vlad's reign belongs to this same 1462 Ottoman invasion. As Sultan Mehmed's massive retaliatory army advanced toward Vlad's capital at Targovishte, multiple period accounts, including some written from the Ottoman side, which gives this particular episode a somewhat broader evidentiary base than the purely Saxon material, describe the invading force encountering a field of thousands of impaled bodies left along the approach to the city, a mixture, by these accounts, of Ottoman prisoners and captives taken during the preceding campaign, arranged in rows extending for a significant distance. The psychological effect described in these accounts is dramatic. Hardened Ottoman soldiers reportedly unsettled enough by the sight that it factored into Mehmed's own eventual decision not to press the assault on the capital directly. This account holds this specific episode at the level its evidence actually supports, broadly attested across more than one source tradition, genuinely significant to how the campaign unfolded, but resting on period chronicle description rather than physical forensic confirmation of numbers or exact arrangement. What can be said, weighing all of this together, without either excusing the brutality or inflating it past what the record actually supports? Vlad III ruled through calculated public terror, used deliberately against both domestic and foreign enemies, over a documented 6-year reign that nonetheless achieved a level of internal political stability his father and brother had never managed to hold. The worst documented numbers associated with him come from sources with a direct, traceable propaganda interest in maximizing his monstrousness. The best documented pattern, impalement used visibly, repeatedly, as an instrument of both punishment and psychological warfare, is corroborated broadly enough, across enough independent traditions, that it cannot be dismissed as pure invention either. Both of those things are true here, at once, and the honest version of this story has room for both. None of it lasted. That is the part the terror and legend version of this story tends to skip past, because it is less dramatic than a forest of stakes, but arguably more important to what actually happened to Vlad's body. And it starts, oddly enough, not with an enemy, but with the one ruler who was supposed to be his ally. When Vlad crossed north into Hungarian territory after the failed 1462 campaign, he was moving toward Matthias Corvinus, expecting reinforcement, funding, and the backing of a king who had every stated reason to support him. Corvinus was sitting on a substantial sum of papal money, raised across Europe specifically to fund a renewed crusade against Ottoman expansion, and Vlad, having just fought the Ottomans directly, on the ground, at real cost, was about as credible an anti-Ottoman ally as the region currently offered. While Vlad made that journey north, Wallachia itself did not sit empty. His younger brother Radu, the same brother whose Ottoman court upbringing had gone so much more smoothly than Vlad's, was installed by the Ottomans as the new voivode, backed by the same military structure that had just driven Vlad from power. Radu's reign would prove considerably longer and, on the surface, considerably quieter than either of his brothers. A client ruler, cooperative with Ottoman interests, largely absent from the kind of dramatic chronicle material that fills the rest of this story. That contrast matters. It is the clearest available demonstration of what the Ottoman Empire actually wanted from a Wallachian ruler. Not defiance, not terror campaigns, simply steady, reliable tribute and non-interference. And it throws into sharper relief exactly how unusual and how personally chosen Vlad's earlier confrontational path had been. What happened instead is one of the stranger reversals in this entire story. Corvinus had Vlad arrested and imprisoned, and the official justification given for that arrest rested substantially on a set of letters, supposedly written by Vlad himself, in which he offered to abandon the anti-Ottoman cause entirely and instead help broker peace, or worse, cooperation, between Wallachia and the Sultan. Here is where the record gets genuinely disputed, in the strict sense of that word. Not unknown, but actively argued over by people who have looked at the same documents and reached different conclusions. A significant body of historical scholarship treats these letters with real suspicion, and the reasoning is worth walking through, rather than just asserting. Corvinus, at the moment of Vlad's arrest, had already quietly abandoned his own planned crusade campaign. He had turned his army back rather than press forward against Ottoman forces, for reasons that had more to do with Hungarian domestic politics and available funds than with any change of heart about the Ottoman threat. That left him holding a large sum of crusade money that had not been spent on a crusade and needing an explanation for why. A supposedly treacherous ally, caught corresponding secretly with the enemy, made for a considerably more convenient story than the king changed his mind. Whether the letters were outright forgeries, genuine but taken out of context, or something in between, is not something this account can resolve, because the letters themselves have not survived in a form scholars can independently authenticate against Vlad's confirmed correspondence. What can be said honestly is this: the timing, the convenience, and the financial motive all point toward reasonable grounds for suspicion, and a meaningful portion of modern historical scholarship treats the letters as likely fabricated, at least in part, to provide Corvinus political cover. It is also worth asking what Corvinus stood to gain beyond a simple accounting excuse. A captured, discredited former ally, cast as a would-be traitor, gave Corvinus a convenient narrative for domestic Hungarian politics as well. Proof, to nobles and clergy who had funded the crusade effort, that the king had been vigilant against genuine treachery rather than simply indecisive about using the money he had raised. Political cover, in other words, was not the only benefit on offer. Vlad's imprisonment did double duty, explaining away an unspent war chest, while simultaneously reinforcing Corvinus's own image as a shrewd, uncompromising defender of the anti-Ottoman cause, even while the actual crusading had quietly stalled. There is a second, closely related detail worth connecting here, back to the propaganda material this story examined in the room before this one. The years of Vlad's Hungarian captivity are, by the estimates of the scholars who study the printing and circulation of the German-language atrocity pamphlets, roughly the same years those pamphlets began actively circulating across German-speaking Europe in their earliest forms. Years before the more famous, later editions that would eventually shape Bram Stoker's Victorian-era research centuries afterward. This account cannot prove direct coordination between Corvinus's court and the pamphlet writers responsible for those earliest editions. What it can say is that the timing created an obvious mutual benefit. A monstrous, universally feared prisoner made Corvinus's continued detention of Vlad look prudent rather than politically convenient, at exactly the moment his own crusade money remained conspicuously unspent. Whether that benefit was actively exploited or simply fell into place on its own, the practical effect was the same. The worst version of Vlad's reputation and the most convenient version of Corvinus's excuse were, for several years, growing in the same direction at the same time. Whatever the truth of the letters, the imprisonment was real, and it lasted for years. The exact duration and its exact conditions vary between accounts, with some describing a harsher initial confinement, possibly at Visegrad, that gradually relaxed over time. What the later years of that captivity apparently did include, according to multiple accounts, was a marriage. Vlad married a woman connected to Corvinus's own family, by some accounts a relative of the king himself, and some sources describe an accompanying conversion, or at least outward conformity, to Roman Catholicism, a genuinely significant claim for a ruler whose family and political identity had been built, in part, on Eastern Orthodox affiliation, and the order of the Dracula. This account holds that conversion claim at reasonable inference rather than confirmed fact, because the surviving evidence for it is not uniform across sources, but the marriage itself into Corvinus's circle is comparatively well attested and marks the real turning point, from prisoner back toward useful ally. The shift from prisoner to relative did not happen in isolation from the wider regional picture either. By the later 1460s, Ottoman pressure on Hungary's own borders had intensified enough that Corvinus's calculus around Vlad changed again. A battle-tested commander, with direct combat experience against Ottoman forces, and a genuine personal motive to want his old throne back, was simply too useful a resource to keep locked away once the immediate political need for a scapegoat had passed. The record does not preserve a single dramatic moment of reconciliation between the two men. What it shows instead is a gradual, practical thaw, relaxed confinement, then residence at court, then marriage, then, eventually, active military cooperation again. The same slow rebuilding of alliance that this story's earlier rooms already flagged as the defining rhythm of Vlad's entire political life. He did not stay loyal to any one patron for long. He also did not stay discarded for long either, because the same qualities that made him dangerous to hold as a prisoner made him valuable to release as an ally, the moment circumstances shifted again. There is a reason this room exists at all, in a story ostensibly about a grave. It is because the years Vlad spent as Corvinus's captive then relative are the years in which the political alliances that would eventually put him back on the Wallachian throne, and then, within months, get him killed there, were quietly being rebuilt. The forged or not letters did not end Vlad's political life. They interrupted it, reshaped it, and rerouted it through a Hungarian court that would, a decade or so later, send him back south one final time. The third reign lasted, by most reconstructions, somewhere in the range of 2 months. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment, because everything this story has spent the last several rooms building toward, the purges, the imprisonment, the marriage, the decade of rebuilt alliances, collapses into a final chapter, shorter than most modern film shoots. By the mid-1470s, Vlad had rebuilt enough political standing to matter again. He had Corvinus's backing, restored at least partially through the Hungarian court connections. His imprisonment had, strangely, helped cement. He also gained the support of a genuinely formidable regional figure, Stephen the Great of Moldavia, his cousin, one of the most capable rulers in the region during this entire period, who had his own reasons, dynastic, strategic, and personal, for wanting a friendly ruler back on the Wallachian throne rather than the current Ottoman-aligned occupant, Basarab Laiota. With this combined backing, Vlad moved south in 1476, and by that November he had retaken Targoviste and reclaimed the Wallachian throne for a third time. The man he displaced, Basarab Laiota, was no stranger to this story's larger pattern, a rival Wallachian claimant, aligned with Ottoman backing, who had himself held the throne on and off across the same turbulent years that had cycled through Vlad, Radu, and now Basarab in rapid succession. Basarab did not simply concede the throne and disappear. He retreated, regrouped with whatever Ottoman-aligned support he could still muster, and remained an active threat to Vlad's restored rule for the entire brief span of this third reign, which is a significant part of why that reign never had the chance to stabilize the way the 6-year second reign eventually had. Vlad returned to a country still fractured by exactly the same competing loyalties, the same rotating cast of foreign-backed claimants that had defined every single chapter of Wallachian politics across his entire adult life. Nothing about the political landscape he came back to in 1476 had actually been resolved. It had simply paused, waiting for whichever claimant could hold the throne long enough to matter. Stephen the Great's support, meanwhile, came with its own complicated context, worth naming honestly. Stephen was not a disinterested ally, acting purely out of family loyalty. Moldavia had its own long, uneasy relationship with both Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire, and a friendly, indebted Vlad back on the Wallachian throne, a ruler who owed his restoration directly to Moldavian and Hungarian support, served Stephen's own strategic interests as much as it served Vlad's personal ambitions. This is worth remembering precisely because it undercuts any simple, sentimental reading of Vlad's final campaign as a triumphant homecoming. It was, more accurately, one more transaction in a lifetime, built almost entirely out of them, foreign backing extended in exchange for a ruler who would, if he held on long enough, prove useful to the powers who had put him there. What followed was not stability. It was, almost immediately, another contest for the same throne, against the same basic set of pressures that had unseated him twice before. Ottoman-backed rivals, uncertain boyar loyalty, and a fragile coalition of foreign support that could not be guaranteed to hold. By December of that same year, or January of the year following, depending on which chronology a given source follows, Vlad was dead, killed, according to the converging weight of the surviving accounts, in or near a battle fought close to Bucharest, with his own remaining forces and likely some allied troops engaged against Ottoman-backed Wallachian rivals. Past that basic outline, the specifics fracture in genuinely interesting ways, and this account will hold each version at the evidence tier it has earned, rather than picking a favorite and presenting it as settled. One tradition describes Vlad falling in the direct chaos of battle, cut down by enemy soldiers in the ordinary, brutal manner of 15th century warfare. A death with no particular mystery to it beyond the mystery every medieval battlefield death carries, which is that precise, eyewitness-verified detail rarely survives the person it describes. A second tradition, less charitable to the people around him, describes a more compromised end. Vlad allegedly killed not by the enemy directly, but in confusion, by his own men, or by an ambush exploiting the visual similarity between his own escort's equipment and Ottoman gear in the low light or smoke of an active engagement. A third detail, appearing across a genuinely wider spread of sources than either of the first two competing narratives, and therefore worth treating with somewhat more confidence, describes his death being followed by decapitation, with his head separated from his body, preserved, and sent south to Constantinople, delivered to Sultan Mehmed as physical proof that the man who had impaled the Sultan's own envoys years earlier, and who had haunted the edge of Ottoman military planning for over a decade, was finally, verifiably gone. The practice itself was not unusual by the standards of the period. Displaying the head of a defeated, especially defiant enemy was a recognized method, across multiple cultures and courts of this era, of providing unambiguous proof of death to a wary population and a watching rival power, proof that rumor and hearsay could not easily fabricate or dispute. For a sultan who had, by this point, spent well over a decade dealing with Vlad as a recurring, personally humiliating problem, the failed night raid on his own camp, the burned countryside, the forest of impaled prisoners that had reportedly unsettled his own army. A confirmed, displayed head represented something close to formal closure. It is also, incidentally, exactly the kind of detail a court chronicler on the winning side has strong motive to record accurately and in detail, which is part of why this particular strand of the death story carries somewhat more source weight than the competing accounts of exactly how, tactically, the fatal moment on the battlefield unfolded. None of this resolves the tactical question of who specifically struck the fatal blow, or under what exact circumstances: enemy action, confused ambush, or something in between remain genuinely competing possibilities in the surviving record, and this account will not pretend otherwise. What the weight of the evidence does support, reasonably confidently, is the outcome: a battlefield death, a physical separation of head and body, and a head that left the country entirely, traveling south to a capital many days' journey from wherever the rest of him was left behind. That single detail, head sent to Constantinople, body left behind on or near the Wallachian battlefield, is the reason this story can return, now, to a grave near a lake, with a genuinely different frame than the one it opened with. If Vlad's head and body were separated at the moment of his death, in the field, far from any monastery, then the question of where is Vlad III buried was never actually one question. It may always have been two, and the confusion did not end with his death. In the immediate aftermath, no single, unified Wallachian, Hungarian, or Ottoman account agreed on every detail of what had happened, where or to whom the credit and the blame belonged. A fragmentation this story's opening room already promised would matter. 3 countries, 3 different traditions, unable to fully agree even now on where the story actually ends. Basarab Lyota moved quickly to reclaim the throne Vlad had held for barely 2 months. Hungarian and Moldavian sources each preserved their own versions of the campaign's end, shaped, inevitably, by their own stake in how the alliance's brief success or failure ought to be remembered. And on the Ottoman side, a delivered head was recorded as confirmation of victory, closing the matter from that direction entirely, regardless of whatever remained unresolved everywhere else. A single death, 3 separate political interests, each with its own reason to tell the story a particular way. That is the environment the empty grave at Snagov was born into. Not a quiet, uncontested burial arranged by a grieving, unified court, but the tail end of a chaotic, 3-sided ending to a life that had never, at any point, belonged fully to one country or one narrative. Return, now, to Snagov, with everything this story has since learned sitting underneath it like a foundation the island's stone floor was built on top of. The lake that surrounds Snagov has not made independent verification any easier either. The island's isolation, the same isolation that made it an attractive monastic retreat 5 centuries ago, has also meant that later renovations, wartime disruptions, and simple centuries of continuous religious use have all left their own layers on top of whatever 15th century ground truth once existed beneath that church floor. Every subsequent excavation or survey at the site has had to work through those accumulated layers first, which is part of why Rosetti's 1933 findings remain the most cited, and still, in important respects, the most complete physical investigation this particular grave has ever received. Recall the shape of what denouement Rosetti found there in 1933. Beneath the tombstone popularly attributed to Vlad, no coffin, no tomb chamber, no organized skeleton, only a scattered mix of bones and, notably, jaws of horses, the kind of material more consistent with disturbed ground and secondary deposits than with an intact, undisturbed burial. And recall the second detail that this account has been carrying since Room 1, mostly unexamined until now. A second unmarked grave near the monastery door, containing a body dressed in fragments of rich fabric, in a position monastic tradition in this region would have read as a mark of dishonor rather than reverence. Buried where the humblest members of a community were buried, not where its patrons were. It is worth pausing on how genuinely unusual this second grave is, on its own terms, before folding it back into the larger Vlad question. Monasteries of this period and region kept careful track of who was buried where, specifically because burial position communicated status to every subsequent generation of monks and visitors. A patron's grave near the altar was not just tradition. It was, in effect, a permanent physical advertisement of the relationship between monastery and benefactor, maintained deliberately across generations. An unmarked grave by the door, by contrast, was the kind of burial a community gave someone it did not want, visibly associated with its most honored dead. An unidentified traveler, a disgraced figure, or a body interred quickly, under circumstances that did not allow for the usual care. Whichever of those categories the second grave's occupant actually falls into, its very existence tells us something concrete about the conditions of that particular burial, even without a name attached to it. Consider both details again now, with a fuller biography sitting behind them. A body separated from its head in the chaos of a battlefield death near Bucharest, brought, if it was brought anywhere organized at all, some real distance to reach Snagov, is exactly the kind of burial candidate that could plausibly end up incomplete, hastily interred, or misidentified by the time it reached consecrated ground. A monastery that Vlad had endowed, yes, and was reportedly loyal to in life, but also a monastery whose monks, like so much of the Wallachian religious and boyar establishment across his 3 reigns, had no guarantee of uncomplicated loyalty back. This was a ruler who had purged nobility, clashed repeatedly with the boyar class that overlapped heavily with monastic patronage networks, and died in the middle of yet another contested, 3-way succession fight. A rushed, quiet, undecorated burial near a side door, rather than a formal tomb befitting a patron and prince, is not a difficult scenario to construct from what this story already knows about how the people around Vlad actually treated him, in life, when convenient. None of that is confirmation. It is, at best, a scenario that fits the evidence better than a simple, "the grave was always empty and always a mystery" framing would suggest. And this account will hold it exactly there. A reasonable inference, built from corroborated surrounding facts, not a verified answer. What the 1933 excavation did not settle, and what no excavation since has fully settled either, is whose body occupied that second grave, or whether it is connected to Vlad at all. Romanian archaeological and historical work in the decades following Rosetti's dig has continued to examine Snagov's layout and its documented history as a site of continuous religious use across centuries, which itself complicates any confident reading of what any given grave inside its grounds actually represents. Multiple bodies, multiple burial periods, and centuries of monastery renovation and disruption all sit on top of each other at a site like this, and separating a 15th century burial from later disturbances is a genuinely difficult forensic problem, one that has not, as of the most recent published archaeological work this account was able to verify, produced a scientifically confirmed identification linking any specific remains at Snagov to Vlad III. The 1933 excavation itself has also, understandably, come under some methodological scrutiny in light of later archaeological standards. Rosetti was working nearly a century ago with the tools, dating techniques, and documentation practices available at the time, considerably less rigorous by modern forensic standards than what a comparable excavation would produce today. That does not invalidate his central, physical finding. Whatever was recorded as present or absent beneath that stone was recorded by a trained archaeologist in a formal excavation and published rather than merely rumored. It does mean that a fully modern re-examination of Snagov's grounds, using contemporary forensic and dating methods, remains a genuinely open scientific opportunity that has not yet been pursued at the scale Rosetti's original findings would justify revisiting. Snagov's story since 1933 has not been one of renewed archaeological attention so much as continued symbolic use. Across the 20th century, the site and Vlad's association with it were repeatedly folded into broader Romanian national narratives. Most visibly during the later decades of communist rule, when state-sponsored historical commemoration occasionally reframed Vlad III not as a foreign fiction monster, but as a fiercely independent Wallachian defender against Ottoman domination, a usable symbol of resistance for a government interested in nationalist legitimacy. That political reframing did not involve new excavation or new physical evidence. It involved the same unresolved grave, retold for a new political purpose, which is worth naming plainly here. This account is not the first version of the Vlad story, shaped by the needs of whoever happened to be telling it, and it will not be the last. What sets a genuinely evidence-based retelling apart is not immunity from that pull, but honesty about the difference between what the ground has actually shown and what a given era wanted the story to mean. There is a temptation in telling this kind of story to resolve the tension for the audience, to pick the second grave, declare it Vlad's, and move on to a satisfying close. This account will not do that, because the honest state of the evidence does not support it. What can be said is this: Snagov remains the single most historically grounded candidate site for Vlad's original intended burial, based on his documented patronage of the monastery and its centuries-old association with his name in Wallachian tradition. The 1933 excavation confirmed that whatever burial once existed under the traditional tombstone is not there now, in any recoverable, identifiable form. And the second grave, modest, unmarked, positioned exactly where dishonor, rather than honor, would have placed a body, remains the site's most tantalizing open thread, genuinely consistent with a hurried, complicated end to a genuinely hurried, complicated final reign, but still, honestly, unconfirmed. Which is incidentally exactly the condition under which a second candidate site becomes worth taking seriously, not as a replacement theory invented to manufacture drama, but because it is the site modern Romanian historians increasingly point to when asked directly where they would actually look next. That site is Comana, a monastery Vlad founded himself, on an island of its own, in marshland southeast of Bucharest, and, more importantly for this story, sitting close to where the historical record places his final battle. Comana's own founding is well documented in a way that gives this candidate site a slightly different character than Snagov's. Where Vlad's relationship to Snagov rests on land grants and privileges extended to an already established monastery, Comana appears to have been established, or substantially re-established, directly under his personal patronage, a foundation act, rather than simply an endowment, which some historians read as evidence of a deeper, more personal religious investment on Vlad's part in this particular site during the later years of his life. A ruler founding his own monastery in this period was not a purely spiritual gesture. It was also a statement of permanence and legacy, the kind of institution a founder might reasonably expect, and even plan, to be associated with in death as well as in life. The logic that draws modern researchers toward Comana is not romantic. It is procedural, built from how burial actually tended to work in this period, for a ruler who died in the field rather than at home. Battlefield death, especially sudden, contested, chaotic death, of the kind the record describes for Vlad's third reign ending, did not typically produce a body transported great distances to a preferred, favored resting place. It produced, far more often, a body interred at the nearest suitable consecrated ground, ideally somewhere the deceased already had a documented connection to, since an unaffiliated local church would have little reason or resource to take in and properly bury a fallen ruler's remains. Comana fits that pattern in a way Snagov, located a genuinely significant distance to the north, does not fit nearly as well. Vlad endowed Comana. It stood, by the geography this account has already established, close to the zone where his final campaign and death took place. And unlike Snagov, no 19th or 20th century excavation has yet definitively ruled out an intact burial existing there, because comprehensive, modern archaeological investigation of Comana's grounds has been more limited than the work done at Snagov. That last point cuts in two directions at once, and this account will name both, because doing anything else would be exactly the kind of one-sided tomb detective storytelling the earlier sections of this pack committed to avoiding. Limited investigation means Comana's case is currently more theoretical than proven. There is no 1933-style excavation report to point to, no tomb, only many bones and jaws of horses, level primary account, establishing what actually is, or is not, physically present there. Everything said in Comana's favor so far in this room is inference from historical logic and geography, not confirmation from a shovel and a published field report. But limited investigation also means Comana has not been ruled out the way Snagov's traditional tombstone location effectively has. It remains, in the most literal sense, an open site, one where a confirmatory or disconfirming find could still, in principle, be made. Part of why Comana has not received Snagov's level of archaeological attention is practical rather than scholarly. Snagov's proximity to Bucharest and its centuries-old, well-documented place in Wallachian tradition made it the natural first target for a researcher like Rosetti, working in the 1930s, with limited resources and a specific tradition to test. Comana's connection to Vlad's death is, by comparison, a conclusion built more recently from historical and geographic reasoning than from an unbroken chain of local tradition pointing to one specific spot, the way Snagov's tombstone did. That does not make Comana's case weaker as history. If anything, a claim built from independent historical logic, rather than centuries of possibly drifting oral tradition, has its own kind of evidentiary strength. It does mean the site has simply not yet had its own version of a 1933 excavation, its own Rosetti moment, willing to open the ground and publish exactly what is or is not found there. Romanian historians and archaeologists who favor Comana over Snagov as the more probable actual resting place tend to build their case on exactly this combination: better geographic logic for a battlefield-adjacent burial, Vlad's own documented, personal religious patronage of the site during his lifetime, and the simple absence of a Rosetti-style negative excavation result that would rule it out the way Snagov's has been at least partially ruled out. It is, in the language this account has used throughout, a strongly supported hypothesis rather than a confirmed fact, resting on real historical reasoning rather than romantic guesswork, but still short of the physical, forensic confirmation that would be required to call the question closed. There is a version of this story that would resolve the tension here by simply declaring a winner. Comana over Snagov. Case closed. Mystery solved. That version would be more satisfying to deliver, and honestly, easier to write. It would also not be true to what the actual state of the evidence supports, as of the most recent published archaeological and historical work this account was able to verify. Both sites remain candidates. Both have real evidence and real reasoning behind them. Neither has been confirmed through remains that scientific analysis has definitively linked to Vlad III himself. This account will also note, briefly, a smaller supporting detail sometimes raised in Comana's favor. The monastery's continued religious and historical significance within Romania across the centuries since Vlad's death, maintained and referenced in local records, in a manner broadly consistent with a site the Wallachian religious establishment considered genuinely important, though this account holds that detail at the level it deserves, as circumstantial supporting context rather than independent proof of anything specific about a burial. It is worth being honest, too, about why that gap has not yet been closed. Comprehensive modern archaeological investigation is expensive, slow, and dependent on institutional priority setting that has, across the past several decades, simply had other demands competing for the same limited funding and attention. A definitive Comana excavation, carried out with the forensic and dating techniques available today rather than the comparatively basic methods available to Rosetti in 1933, remains entirely possible. It has just not yet happened at the scale this particular question would need to actually settle it. What this does mean, though, is that the question this story opened with, a locked stone slab and no body underneath it, was never really a question with a single missing answer waiting to be found. It was, and still is, a question with at least two live candidates. A genuinely disputed medieval death that separated a body from a head somewhere on a battlefield 6 centuries ago, and a historical record honest enough, when you actually sit with it the way this story has tried to admit that the search itself has not yet finished. That admission is not a disappointing ending. It is, if anything, the most historically honest place this story could possibly land, and it is exactly the place where the science this story has leaned on so far, the archaeology, the chronicle cross-referencing, the propaganda source skepticism, starts running up against its own genuine limits, which is worth spending real time on, honestly and directly, before this story tries to close anything at all. Everything this story has covered so far has stayed inside one country. 2 Romanian monasteries, an inconclusive excavation, a disputed battlefield death, a documented 6-year reign of calculated terror, all of it Wallachian, all of it Romanian soil. That is about to change, and it is going to change in a direction almost nothing in this story so far would have prepared you for. Recall a detail this story planted deliberately several rooms ago and asked you to hold on to. The Order of the Dragon, the chivalric brotherhood that gave Vlad's family its name, and the promise that its symbol would resurface somewhere none of Vlad's contemporaries could have predicted. That place is Naples. Specifically, a 15th century church called Santa Maria la Nova on the Italian mainland, roughly 1,000 miles from Snagov, in a kingdom that had no direct role in anything this story has described so far. The connection runs through Vlad's own bloodline, not through any battlefield or excavation. Historical genealogical research indicates Vlad had a daughter, generally identified in surviving records as Maria Balsha, whose life, unlike her father's, is not centered on Wallachian politics at all. It runs instead toward the kingdom of Naples, where she is understood to have married into the Del Balzo family, one of the most prominent noble houses of the southern Italian aristocracy. Marriages of this kind, connecting Wallachian and other Eastern European noble families to Western Italian courts, were not unheard of in this period, though this specific match placed a direct descendant of Vlad III inside one of Naples's most powerful families at exactly the kind of remove from Ottoman and Hungarian politics that a family fleeing generations of instability might reasonably have wanted. Inside Santa Maria la Nova sits a funerary monument that, in 2014, became the center of a genuinely striking claim. An Italian legal historian and researcher, Raffaello Glini, proposed, after years of archival and heraldic research, that this monument's carved imagery, including a dragon motif and an accompanying sphinx-like figure, was not generic decorative flourish, but a deliberate, coded reference to the Order of the Dragon, and through it, to Vlad III himself. Glini's broader claim went further still, that Maria Balsha, once established in Naples, arranged for her father's remains, or some portion of them, to be transported from Wallachia and reinterred there, under the protection of her adopted family, far from the political enemies who had hunted him for most of his adult life. The logistics of such a transfer, if it happened, would themselves have been extraordinary for the period. A journey of roughly 1,000 miles, by land and sea, across multiple political jurisdictions, at a time when moving even living dignitaries such distances safely was a genuine undertaking, let alone moving remains discreetly enough to avoid drawing the attention of any of the several parties who might have had reason to intervene. That difficulty cuts both ways in evaluating the claim. It is precisely the kind of extraordinary, resource-intensive effort a devoted daughter with real means and real motive might undertake for a father whose remains she felt deserved better than a hurried, disputed Wallachian burial. It is also exactly the kind of claim that, absent surviving documentation of the journey itself, remains difficult to verify through anything other than the circumstantial symbolism Glini's research is built on. It is worth walking through what the physical monument actually shows, because the strength of Glini's argument depends entirely on how convincingly those carved details connect back to Vlad specifically, rather than to generic 15th century Italian funerary imagery. The dragon motif, on its own, would not be especially unusual. Dragons appear throughout period heraldry and religious art across Western Europe, symbolizing everything from evil vanquished by saints to purely decorative flourish. What Glini's research leans on is the specific pairing and positioning of that dragon alongside a sphinx-like figure, a combination he argues echoes symbolism associated with the Order of the Dragon's own visual language rather than standard Italian ecclesiastical iconography of the period. He further points to genealogical documentation connecting Maria Balsha's marriage into the Del Balzo line with reasonable confidence, arguing that the family connection alone makes a deliberate, coded memorial plausible, even without an inscription explicitly naming Vlad. The counter-argument, advanced by historians who reject or heavily discount the theory, does not deny the genealogical connection outright. It challenges the leap from a descendant of Vlad lived in Naples and is buried near this monument to this specific monument was built to memorialize Vlad's own transported remains. Heraldic symbolism from this period was widely shared, regionally varied in its exact meaning, and frequently reused across unrelated families and monuments for reasons having nothing to do with any specific ancestor. A dragon and a sphinx carved onto a 15th century Neapolitan tomb, these critics argue, is suggestive at best, and the leap to "this is where Vlad III's body was secretly relocated" requires several additional, currently unverified assumptions. That remains were transported at all, across a genuinely enormous distance for the period, without leaving behind any surviving Wallachian, Hungarian, or Ottoman record of such an unusual undertaking, and that Maria Balsha held both the means and the specific motive to arrange it during a turbulent, transitional period in her own life. This account finds real merit on both sides of that disagreement, and will not pretend the matter is more settled than it is, in either direction. The genealogical connection between Vlad and the Del Balzo family, through Maria Balsha, rests on a stronger documentary foundation than casual internet retellings of the Naples theory often suggest. This is not a claim invented from nothing, but the specific leap from documented family connection to confirmed relocated remains is exactly the kind of gap this account has flagged consistently throughout this entire story. A real historical thread, reasoned carefully by a credentialed researcher, that has not yet been tested against the kind of physical evidence that would actually resolve it one way or the other. No DNA sample, no forensic dating of any remains beneath that monument, no excavation report comparable to Rosetti's, just heraldry, genealogy, and an argument, serious enough to take seriously, incomplete enough that this account will not present it as more than that. No, this account will hold that claim exactly where the evidence currently allows, and no further. It is a real, seriously advanced research claim, made by a named researcher with a documented archival and heraldic case behind it, not an internet rumor invented for shock value, and this account will not pretend it is less substantial than that. It is also a claim that has drawn real, pointed skepticism from mainstream Romanian historians and archaeologists, several of whom have publicly characterized the Naples theory as circumstantial, a plausible-sounding heraldic coincidence and a documented family connection, but nothing approaching the kind of physical, forensic confirmation that would be needed to say, with any real confidence, that human remains beneath that Neapolitan monument actually belonged to Vlad III. No excavation of the Naples tomb, comparable to Rosetti's 1933 dig at Snagov, has been carried out and published with verified findings. The claim rests on symbolism and family history, reasoned carefully, but not yet tested against physical remains the way Snagov's tradition was tested nearly a century ago, which brings this story to the point it has been building toward since the very first room. This was never a story with one grave and one missing body waiting for a single correct answer. It is, honestly, a story with 3 separate claims, sitting in 3 separate countries, each resting on a different kind of evidence. Snagov's centuries-old local tradition, tested once and found physically wanting. Comana's geographic and historical logic, plausible but archaeologically untested. And now Naples's heraldic and genealogical case, seriously argued but sharply disputed by the historians closest to the primary Wallachian record. It is also worth noting that the Naples claim, unlike Snagov and Comana, emerged not from a chain of continuous local tradition stretching back to Vlad's own century, but from 21st century archival detective work. Modern researchers examining old genealogical records and old church architecture with fresh eyes, rather than a story passed down generation after generation by people who believed themselves to be its original keepers. That difference does not automatically make the claim weaker. It does mean the Naples theory carries a different kind of evidentiary character than the Romanian candidates, newer, more explicitly reconstructed, and therefore, in its own way, easier to scrutinize, precisely because its reasoning was laid out recently, in modern published form, rather than inherited as unquestioned local memory, the way Snagov's tombstone tradition was, for 4.5 centuries, before anyone thought to test it. None of the three has been confirmed. None of the three has been definitively ruled out either, and that, itself, is the honest shape of where this 6th century search actually stands. Not a mystery waiting on one final clue, but a genuinely open, three-sided historical argument that the remainder of this story is going to sit inside honestly rather than resolve artificially for the sake of a tidy ending. It would be reasonable, at this point, to ask why modern science simply hasn't settled this. DNA analysis has identified centuries-old remains in other famous cases. A king found under a parking lot, a czar's family confirmed in a forest grave. Why not Vlad? Those comparison cases are worth naming directly, because they show what a resolved version of this exact kind of mystery actually looks like. In 2012, archaeologists in England excavated beneath a municipal parking lot and recovered a skeleton later confirmed through a combination of radiocarbon dating, osteological analysis matching known battle injuries, and mitochondrial DNA comparison against living descendants traced through an unbroken maternal line to be a medieval king lost for centuries. In a separate, unrelated case, the remains of a Russian imperial family, executed and buried in secret, were located, exhumed, and confirmed through DNA comparison against surviving royal relatives decades after their deaths. Both cases succeeded because they had the two ingredients this room has already identified as essential: recoverable genetic material and a verified comparison sample to test it against. The honest answer starts with what modern forensic identification actually requires, and how rarely 15th century circumstances provide it. Confirming that a set of skeletal remains belongs to a specific historical individual generally requires two things working together: genetic material well enough preserved to sequence, and a reliable comparison sample, either a confirmed direct descendant's DNA or remains from a close, independently verified relative, to check it against. For a case like the English king found beneath a car park, both pieces were available: physical remains in reasonably good condition and a documented, traceable maternal line to a living descendant centuries later. For Vlad III, neither piece currently exists in a usable form. No remains at Snagov, Comana, or Naples have been forensically confirmed as his in the first place, which means there is nothing yet to sequence. And even if usable remains were found and dated correctly to the right century, no confirmed, unbroken genetic line to a known living descendant has been established and published to compare them against. The genealogical record, including the Maria Balsha connection this story just examined, remains a matter of documentary and heraldic reasoning, not verified genetic tracing. That does not mean science has contributed nothing to this case. It has, just not in the way popular imagination tends to expect. In 2022, a team of researchers turned to a source no one had previously approached this way: not bones, but paper. 2 surviving letters, written and personally signed by Vlad III during his lifetime, were analyzed using modern molecular techniques, capable of detecting trace protein residue left behind on centuries-old parchment, residue from the hands, breath, and body of whoever handled the documents most closely and most repeatedly, which, for a ruler's personal correspondence, is a reasonable candidate for the ruler himself. The analysis recovered human protein biomarkers, including markers researchers associated with possible inflammatory conditions, of the kind that might correspond to skin or respiratory complaints. This is a genuinely significant scientific result, and this account will hold it at the confidence level it has earned. Strongly supported published research using real molecular biology on real primary source documents Vlad is understood to have personally handled. It is not proof of his health condition in any diagnostic sense, and it says nothing at all about where his remains ended up. What it demonstrates is something narrower but still remarkable. 500 years later, it is still possible to recover genuine biological information connected to Vlad III. Just not, so far, the specific kind of biological information that would resolve a burial dispute. It is worth being specific about what a comparable breakthrough would actually require for Vlad's case, precisely because it clarifies why this remains an open rather than closed investigation. Researchers would need, first, physical remains from one of the 3 candidate sites recovered under controlled, documented archaeological conditions rather than disturbed or informally handled. Second, those remains would need to be well enough preserved after 5.5 centuries to yield sequenceable genetic material. Not a guaranteed outcome, given how significantly burial conditions, soil chemistry, and centuries of disturbance can degrade DNA. And third, researchers would need an independently verified comparison sample from a documented, unbroken Draculish descendant line, established with the same rigor genealogists applied to the English king's case, rather than the more circumstantial family tree reasoning currently underlying the Naples claim. Each of those 3 requirements is individually achievable with present-day techniques. All 3 occurring together, for this specific case, simply has not happened yet. That distinction matters for understanding why this story cannot simply announce a scientific answer and move on. The letter's proteomics study and a hypothetical future DNA identification of remains are different categories of science, aimed at different questions, and progress on one does not automatically produce progress on the other. What the letter's study does suggest, more broadly, is that the toolkit available to researchers working on this exact mystery keeps expanding. Techniques unavailable to Rosetti in 1933, and unavailable even a decade ago, are now recovering real information from 500-year-old materials that earlier generations of researchers would have assumed were forensically silent. If any of the 3 candidate burial sites, Snagov's second grave, an eventual Comana excavation, or a scientifically rigorous examination of the Naples monument, ever produces remains preserved well enough to sequence, the technical capacity to test them against a documented Draculeshti genetic line is closer to realistic than it has ever been in the near century since Rosetti first lifted that stone. It is worth pausing, too, on a caution this account has tried to hold throughout: the gap between what forensic science can plausibly do and what the internet frequently claims it has already done. In the years following both Rosetti's original excavation and the more recent Naples and letters research, various secondary and tertiary retellings, articles, videos, social posts, have periodically claimed more than the underlying research actually supports, announcing DNA confirms or scientists prove, headlines attached to findings that, examined directly, turn out to be exactly the more limited, more honest results this room has just walked through. This account has deliberately avoided repeating any of those inflated claims, because the actual science, described accurately, is already remarkable enough without exaggeration. Real molecular evidence recovered from 5-century-old letters, a serious archival case for a third candidate burial site, and a physical excavation record stretching back to 1933 that still gets cited in peer-reviewed work published this year. The honest version of this story does not need embellishment to hold an audience's attention. It needs, if anything, the opposite. A willingness to say plainly where the evidence actually stops, and to let that stopping point be interesting on its own terms. Because it is one of the deeper reasons this particular 6-century-old case has stayed genuinely alive, rather than settling into a permanently closed chapter of the history books. The tools keep improving. The letters study did not exist a decade ago. The Naples theory did not exist before 2014. Snagov's second grave has never had a comprehensive modern forensic pass at all. This is, in the fullest sense, an active, ongoing historical investigation, not a solved case being retold for entertainment, and not a permanently unsolvable one either, but a genuinely unresolved question that the next decade of archival, archaeological, and molecular research could plausibly move closer to answering. It has simply not happened yet, and an honest account of this mystery has to sit with that "not yet," rather than rushing past it toward a resolution the evidence does not currently support. It is worth returning, one final time, to that dragon, the one this story asked you to hold on to back in the second room, and the one that resurfaced in Naples in a form none of Vlad's contemporaries could have imagined. Vlad too joined the Order of the Dragon roughly 15 years before his son was even born, for reasons entirely about 15th century Christian Ottoman military politics, and entirely unrelated to anything supernatural. The name Dracula followed from that membership directly and mechanically. Son of Dracula, son of the Dragon Order Knight. For the length of Vlad III's own lifetime, and for centuries after his death, across every Wallachian, Hungarian, Ottoman, and Saxon source this story has drawn from, that is the only meaning the name ever carried. Not a monster, not a creature of the night, a hereditary title, worn the way a modern surname carries forward a grandfather's military rank or civic honor, stripped of its original context, but never entirely disconnected from it either. The gap between that historical name and the name most of the audience arrived at this story already knowing belongs almost entirely to one 19th century novelist, working 400 years after Vlad's death, an ocean away, for reasons that had very little to do with Wallachian history and a great deal to do with late Victorian Britain's own anxieties. Bram Stoker, researching his 1897 novel, encountered the name Dracula in a library reference to Wallachian history, and, by his own later accounts, was drawn to it primarily for its sound and its association with a devil translation he found in some of his source material, not because he had conducted any deep study of Vlad III's actual biography, and not because he intended his character to be read as a fictionalized version of a real 15th century ruler. Stoker's Count Dracula borrows the name, a vague Transylvanian geography, and almost nothing else. No boyar purge, no Ottoman hostage years, no forged letters, no third reign, no battlefield death, no empty grave at Snagov. The historical Vlad III and the fictional Count Dracula share a name and, at most, a general regional backdrop. Everything else about the vampire figure that would go on to define global popular culture across the following century was Stoker's own invention, built from broader European vampire folklore that existed independently of Vlad long before Stoker ever picked up a pen. It is worth being specific about how thin the actual textual connection is, because the popular imagination tends to assume Stoker did far more historical research than he actually did. Literary historians who have examined Stoker's surviving notes generally agree he encountered the Dracula name in a single second-hand historical reference work, used it primarily because he liked its sound and its associated meaning, and appears to have known comparatively little about the specific 15th century ruler behind it. Certainly not the Boyar purges, the Ottoman hostage years, or any of the political detail this story has spent 11 rooms carefully reconstructing. The historical Vlad III supplied Stoker with, essentially, a name and a country. Everything that made the character a global cultural phenomenon, the supernatural abilities, the specific vampire mythology, the Gothic atmosphere, came from elsewhere entirely. This is worth stating as plainly as this account can manage, because it is the single most consequential misconception this entire story has had to work against from its very first room. Vlad III was not the historical basis for vampire fiction in any meaningful biographical sense. He was a real, extensively documented 15th century Wallachian ruler, whose life this story has tried to reconstruct as honestly as the surviving record allows. Hostage, claimant, terror-wielding consolidator of power, prisoner, restored ruler, and finally a battlefield casualty whose remains scattered into genuine, still unresolved historical dispute. The vampire is a separate creation, wearing a borrowed name, that happened to become so culturally dominant that it now obscures, for most people encountering this name for the first time, the actual historical figure standing underneath it. Separating those two things back out is not a minor academic correction. It changes what kind of mystery this story actually is. A vampire's grave being empty would fit neatly inside its own genre, its own expectations, its own kind of resolution. A 15th century political prince's grave being empty is a different, and in some ways, more genuinely unsettling problem, because it means the uncertainty this story has spent the last several rooms sitting inside is not fictional uncertainty, built for narrative effect. It is real historical uncertainty about a real person whose actual final resting place is still, tonight, a matter of live, ongoing, evidence-based disagreement among historians who have spent careers on exactly this question. A handful of other popular misconceptions about Vlad, layered on top of the vampire confusion over the centuries, are worth clearing away directly, now that his actual documented life has been laid out in full. The claim that Vlad personally drank the blood of his victims belongs entirely to fiction, and to some of the more sensationalized pamphlet material this story has already flagged as unreliable propaganda. No credible period source, Wallachian, Hungarian, or Ottoman, attributes anything resembling that specific act to him. It is a purely fictional embellishment, added generations after Vlad's death, by writers building the vampire mythos Stoker would later popularize. Not a detail drawn from any historical chronicle this story has relied on. The claim that Vlad invented impalement as a punishment is also not accurate. The method predates him by centuries and was used across multiple cultures and courts of the region, including by the Ottoman Empire itself. What made Vlad's use of it historically distinctive was not the method's invention, but its scale, its visibility, and the deliberate, calculated theater with which he deployed it as a tool of governance. A genuinely severe historical reality that does not require exaggeration or invented details to be understood as brutal. It is also worth clearing up a smaller, but persistent confusion about geography and identity. Vlad III ruled Wallachia, not Transylvania, the region Stoker's novel most famously associates with his fictional count. Transylvania, in Vlad's actual lifetime, was a semi-autonomous region of the Kingdom of Hungary, home to the Saxon merchant towns this story examined earlier, and a place Vlad interacted with primarily as a military and political adversary, rather than as a ruler or resident. Stoker's choice of Transylvania as his fictional count's home was, by most literary historical accounts, drawn from separate travel writing and folklore Stoker encountered in his research, only loosely and after the fact connected to Vlad's actual, historically documented seat of power in Wallachia to the south. None of these corrections diminish the historical Vlad III. If anything, they restore him to a more precise, more genuinely interesting shape than the flattened monster of popular imagination allows. A twice-orphaned hostage who built, through calculated and often brutal terror, 6 years of real internal stability in a country that had rarely managed it before him, and whose actual final resting place, stripped of every vampire myth this story has now carefully set aside, remains a real, unresolved, 6-century-old historical question, still being argued over by serious researchers in 3 different countries, right now, tonight. Hold that thought. The disputed grave, the terror, the imprisonment, the third country this story only just introduced. Because it is time, now, to gather all of it together and ask, honestly, where the search actually stands as of tonight. So, where does it actually stand? It is worth remembering, before answering that directly, just how much this story has actually established with real confidence along the way, even where the grave itself remains unresolved. The broad shape of Vlad's life, the hostage years, the 3 reigns, the boyar purges, the Saxon campaigns, the imprisonment under Corvinus, the Third Reign's brief return and violent end, rests on a genuinely wide, cross-referenced base of period chronicle material from multiple independent political perspectives, Wallachian, Hungarian, and Ottoman alike. That is not a shaky foundation. It is, if anything, one of the better documented royal biographies to survive from this specific region and century. The uncertainty this story keeps returning to is narrower and more specific than, we don't know who Vlad was. It is, precisely and only, we don't know, with physical certainty, where his remains ended up. A much smaller, much more contained gap than the popular, myth-soaked version of this story usually implies. It helps, too, to remember exactly how this story arrived at that gap in the first place, because the path matters as much as the conclusion. It began with a single, testable local tradition, a stone slab, a name never carved into it, and 4.5 centuries during which no one thought to check whether the tradition beneath it was actually true. Rosetti's 1933 excavation was not a dramatic discovery in the popular sense. It was the opposite, a careful, methodical test of an assumption, which happened to fail in a way that opened, rather than closed, the historical question. Everything this story has covered since, the biography, the terror, the imprisonment, the contested death, the Naples claim, the science, exists because one archaeologist, working within his own era's more limited tools, was simply willing to lift a stone that generations before him had left undisturbed. Snagov Monastery remains the site with the deepest historical tradition, and the only completed, published excavation directly testing that tradition, Rosetti's 1933 dig, which found no intact burial beneath the traditional tombstone, only disturbed ground and the bones of horses, and which left behind, near the church door, a second, unmarked, still unidentified grave that has never been definitively connected to Vlad III, or definitively ruled out, either. It is the candidate with the most physical evidence attached to it, and also, oddly, the candidate whose physical evidence has done the most to complicate the tradition, rather than confirm it. Its unresolved second grave remains, in this account's assessment, the single most promising unexamined physical lead among everything this story has covered. A real body, in a real, accessible location, that modern forensic techniques could plausibly examine further if institutional priority and funding ever aligned to make it happen. Comana Monastery remains the site with the strongest geographic and biographical logic, founded personally by Vlad, positioned close to where the historical record places his final battle, fitting the ordinary pattern of how battlefield-adjacent burials tended to work in this period. It is also the candidate that has received the least comprehensive modern archaeological attention of the three, which means its case currently rests more on historical reasoning than on anything a shovel has confirmed or denied. Naples, and the monument inside Santa Maria la Nova, remains the newest, most recently argued, and most sharply contested of the three, a serious, credentialed research claim built from genealogy and heraldic symbolism, connecting Vlad's documented daughter to a documented Neapolitan noble family and a documented dragon-adjacent funerary monument, but a claim that mainstream Romanian historians have largely met with real skepticism, precisely because it has not yet been tested against any physical excavation of its own. It is also worth naming what this story has deliberately not done across all 12 rooms so far. It has not manufactured a false winner among the three candidates to give you a cleaner ending. It has not repeated inflated casualty figures from propaganda pamphlets as though they were settled fact. It has not treated a vivid popular anecdote, the nailed turbans, the vampire myth itself, as equivalent in evidentiary weight to a cross-referenced chronicle account or a published excavation report. Every claim in this story has been held, deliberately, at the confidence level its actual sourcing supports, even when that made for a less tidy narrative than the version of Vlad III most people arrive, already carrying in their heads. 3 sites, 3 countries, 3 different kinds of evidence, held together by one unresolved 6th-century-old question. This account has tried, across every room of this story, to hold each of them at exactly the confidence level the surviving evidence actually supports, not flattening them into false certainty for the sake of a satisfying ending, and not dismissing any of them either, because each one represents real, serious historical work by real researchers who have earned the right to be taken seriously, even where they disagree with each other. What would it actually take to close this case? Realistically, a forensically rigorous excavation of Comana's grounds, comparable in thoroughness to Rosetti's 1933 work at Snagov, but using 21st-century archaeological and dating methods. A proper scientific excavation of the Naples monument, examining whatever remains, if any, actually lie beneath it, rather than relying on heraldic inference alone. And, ideally, a confirmed, published, Draculeshed genetic reference line, robust enough to test any future remains against with real confidence. The missing piece this story's science room identified as the single largest technical gap standing between plausible candidate and confirmed identification for any of the 3 sites. None of that has happened yet. All of it remains, at least in principle, achievable, which is precisely what keeps this from being a closed historical chapter, and makes it, instead, a genuinely live one. Somewhere between a Romanian lake island, a Romanian marsh monastery, and an Italian church built on the wrong side of the continent for anyone to have expected it, the actual physical remains of Vlad III are very likely still resting, undisturbed, in one of 3 places researchers have already identified and are still actively arguing about. Or, just as honestly possible, somewhere none of them have looked yet at all. That is where this search stands tonight. Not solved, not abandoned, genuinely, actively open. 6 centuries after the man at the center of it died on a winter battlefield whose exact circumstances still cannot be fully reconstructed, leaving behind a legacy that fiction would eventually distort beyond recognition, and a body that history, so far, has simply never managed to find. So if you ever find yourself standing on that small island north of Bucharest, looking down at a flat, unmarked stone, with no name cut into it at all, you will understand something most visitors never quite grasp. The silence there is not the silence of a mystery already solved and quietly forgotten. It is the silence of a search still genuinely underway. In Romanian archives, in Italian church records, in laboratories capable of reading 500-year-old protein traces off a folded letter, continuing, patiently, long after the cameras and the tourists have gone. Vlad III lived a life defined, almost entirely, by other people's decisions about where he belonged. A hostage sent away as a child, a claimant installed and removed by armies not his own, a prisoner held for reasons that were never fully about him, a ruler who spent 6 years trying, at devastating cost, to make sure no one could do that to him again. It is a strange kind of fitting, unplanned symmetry that even his own resting place was never fully settled either. 3 countries, 3 claims, and 6 centuries of people still trying, carefully and honestly, to finish a search he never got the chance to finish for himself. If this story kept you company tonight, and you would like to spend more evenings exactly like this one, quiet, unhurried, following the evidence as far as it actually goes, consider staying a while longer, or coming back the next time this channel opens another grave, another archive, another unresolved question history left behind. Sleep well, and if part of this story is still turning over somewhere in the back of your mind as you drift off, that is all right too. Some questions are worth carrying with you a little longer, unfinished, exactly as the evidence has actually left them.